Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Katabasis podcast. Today, I'm really excited for our guest. He is a local author who I've actually admired for a long time, his different works. He teaches also at my undergrad alma mater, so that's a little bit special for me. But today we have David Dominé on. He is an expert on our local true crime and other areas such as the paranormal. He does a lot of local ghost tours and historical tours, as well as write several books. And his newest one is A Dark Room in Glitterball City, which is another name for Louisville, one of our nicknames. It also became an HBO documentary called Murder in Glitterball City, which was actually really fun to watch and see a lot of our fellow local people. But I wanted to invite David on because he knows a lot about the history of Louisville as well as our paranormal history. So thank you, David, for taking time out of your Sunday to come and join us.
Thanks. It's good to be on. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too. All right. So I know, witches here in Louisville have been around for quite some time. We have a pretty magical history. So what can you tell us about it?
Well, when you talk about witchcraft nowadays, you have to be careful.
Hmm.
Um, some people, they're talking about the old-fashioned witches that fly around on broomsticks and
Yeah.
have familiars. And I think most of us agree that a lot of that probably isn't true. The thing
Hmm.
of myth and legend. But what we've been seeing, in the meantime, is a resurgence of people claiming that title because a lot of times, what were the people who were being accused of witches hundreds of years ago? They were usually women and they were marginalized. They were at the edge of society, sometimes literally living at the edge of the village,
Hmm.
at the edge of the forest and things. And so it's interesting to see what's happening nowadays with people kind of reclaiming that. And that always happens a lot, with marginalized groups or repressed groups. And so I'm not really an expert on witchcraft. I'm not a witch myself per se, but I know a lot of people who are witches, and I know some things about what's been going on in the Louisville area, and especially old Louisville, where we have this famous tree at the corner of Sixth and Park called the Witch's Tree. So I know a lot about that, but I do have some witchy friends in the neighborhood, and a lot of the information I know is from my friends who are self-professed witches in the neighborhood and in the city.
I think that's very important because, a lot of history is told to us by the people actually living it, or it was their ancestors. A lot of our history comes from that verbal, storytelling method and learning from others because a lot of witchcraft history isn't really written down for a lot of reasons. Either it was destroyed or we couldn't write it down because that's how we'd be found
Yeah.
in a lot of ways. Yeah.
hmm
So, what can you tell us about the witch's
hmm
tree? That's kind of my favorite part of this story.
I'm not from Louisville originally. I moved here in 1993 to go to law school at U of L, and I was not planning on liking Louisville, much less old Louisville. I was going to do my time and get out of town, but I ended up loving the neighborhood. I love the city, and that's half my life ago. This is my new hometown. I love Louisville. But I was amazed when I moved
Mhm.
to Old Louisville, and uh, it was August 1993 that I moved to town. And from one day to the next, I got an apartment on Third Street within walking distance of law school. And I
Mhm.
started walking around, and I was amazed by all these beautiful old houses. Old Louisville is one of the largest historic preservation districts in the country. There's 45 square blocks of old houses, roughly
Mhm.
1,400 structures in all. And if you travel around the United States, it's hard to find a city or a town with so many old houses left in such a compact, well-preserved area. And so I was immediately taken by all these wonderful old houses and the Victorian mansions. And I was hearing stories about some of them being haunted. And, I've always loved the paranormal and ghost stories. So that was something that really attracted me. But the very first week I arrived, I remember I was walking around and I came to the corner of Sixth and Park. I lived on the south side of Central Park, but I walked to the north side, and at that corner, I saw this gnarled and twisted tree. And if you've seen the witch's tree, you can just tell there's a story there. It's covered with
Oh
all
yeah.
these burls, these big growths. A lot of people think the tree was actually carved that way, but it's not. It's an Osage orange tree, and a lot of the old trees, and this is a very old one, they tend to develop these bumps, these growths, that are called burls. Carpenters really prize them for their woodworking
Mhm.
projects. But half of the branches overhead are dead and craggy, and it's just, there's a story there. And what I noticed is people were often stopping by the tree. And sometimes I'd see people like leave a little note on the tree, or they'd leave a little trinket or something. So I knew there was something going on, but when I asked around, no one really knew anything about the history of the tree. And so, I ended up buying a house in 1999 on Third Street, and that's kind of how I got into writing about the neighborhood. This house I moved in was supposedly haunted. That's what the previous owner told me right before I moved in. And even though I love ghost stories, I'm fascinated by this stuff. I'm kind of a skeptic. I always say, when a ghost walks up and shakes my hand, that's when I'll start believing in them. So I didn't really, take it too seriously. And I bought this house and moved in. And sure enough, within a couple of weeks, all these crazy things began to happen. And because of the publicity around that and the article the newspaper did about me living in a supposedly haunted house, all these people began coming to me. Most of them from old Louisville. They were living in big old houses, and they had stories about would-be paranormal events in their houses. They uncovered scandals associated with the houses, in years before. And that's when I started really paying attention to the oral histories, like you were saying, the stories that were being passed on. And there were some written things, but I realized I wanted to do my part to kind of preserve some of these stories. So I started talking to people and interviewing them. And then I started writing these stories down. To the best of my ability. The thing is, when you're getting, this bit of information about a property from one person and then
Mhm.
another bit from someone who lived there 50 years before, it's all this disjointed stuff, and
Right.
it's hard to kind of connect them. So you got to do a little cobbling together and look for explanations and links that kind of tie some of these events together. So I started writing down the ghost stories of the neighborhood, and I discovered that was a great way to talk about more than just the paranormal.
Hmm.
Ghost stories are a lot more. It's history and architecture, and you can talk about societal problems and social trends and things like that. So I started writing things down, and people wanted more. They kept coming to me with more stories, so I just kept writing it down. And that's kind of how I got to where my 13th book just came out several years ago, A Dark Room in Glitterball City. But when I was living in that house on Third Street that was supposedly haunted, one night I came out. It was like 2 in the morning, and in the backyard, I found someone trying to steal my car.
Oh
And
no.
the person was in the front seat, and he was handicapped. He had one of those Canadian crutches, to get around on.
Oh
And he had a
yeah.
lookout. He had a lookout in the alley, but he couldn't run. He couldn't run very fast. So I was just watch him try to escape down the alley and calling the cops. And the cops finally came, and they ended up not doing anything. But um, and this was like 2000. We had just moved into the house. It was the next year. And when they were writing up the paperwork, and like 4 squad cars came, and the last 2 squad cars, they had, what I gathered, they had just been over by Central Park, and I heard them talking with the other cops, and one of them said, "Do you see that crazy old woman over at the witch's tree?" And um, when they were talking, I realized it was that tree at the corner of
Oh
Sixth and Park. I'd never heard it called the witch's tree before, though. So that was like the first reference I got, that they called it the witch's tree. And that's kind of what led me to do research and find out what I could about that tree. And I went to the tree that night, and I met a woman who insisted she was a gypsy. She wasn't Roma, she told me. And her family had been coming through Louisville for years. They were travelers,
yeah.
and they would always, in the fall, they'd end up in Louisville as they were going from the north to the south. Then in the spring, when they were passing through again, it was from the south to the north. And she said every time they came to town, she always came to, pay homage at the tree. She loved that tree. It was one of her rituals for coming to Louisville. And that's when I realized that there was some kind of tradition there, that people had been doing things at the tree, that people saw it was special. The thing is, I couldn't come up with any proof, you know.
Mhm.
So a lot of it was just talking to people, and then I started getting these other things that, yeah, there was a coven of witches that used to gather there. It was the result of a curse put on the city, but none of this was provable.
Mhm.
Nothing was documented. But like you said, very often these oral traditions, there's some weight to them. And so over the next couple of years, I just, anytime someone told me something about the tree or I found something interesting, I would just kind of jot it down. And then we have the Victorian Ghost Walk in Old Louisville. It's this once a year theatrical tour we do where kind of spirits come alive. And by then, the witch's tree had kind of gained in notoriety, and they wanted me to come up with a character to put at that tree. And that's when I took all the bits of information I had and kind of cobbled together the story that most people, associate with the tree today. And it tied into the fact that there was a big tornado here in Louisville in March of 1890. And the tree that used to be at the corner, because the tree we see today, the witch's tree, is supposedly one that grew up to replace the tree that was stolen from the witches, because there had been a beautiful maple tree there. That's how, the story went that I was hearing. And one year, the city announced its plan to chop the tree down. They wanted to use it for the upcoming May Day celebrations. They wanted to use it as a maypole. And
Mhm.
the witches, of course, didn't like that idea. They said, "Don't chop down our tree or else." And they went ahead and chopped it down anyway. And the head witch, and they went fleeing out of town to the West End because there were still forests out that way back then. And
Mhm.
supposedly she cursed the city before she left. And her last words were, "Beware, Louisville, beware 11th month." And no one took it seriously. They chopped the tree down and they had their May Day celebrations. But sure enough, 11 months later, Louisville was hit with one of the worst tornadoes in its history. And that was the big tornado of March 27th, 1890. It took place exactly 11 months from the date that
Mhm.
the tree had been cut down and the curse issued. And it was written about in all the papers across the country. A lot of people thought Louisville might not recover from the tornado because it was so disastrous. And so the tornado itself is documented, but then the story is after the tornado struck and decimated much of the downtown area, in the dissipating winds that went swirling off in all directions afterwards, one of the like branches of the storm came down to the corner of Sixth and Park, where the witch's tree is today.
Mhm.
And in passing, supposedly a bolt of lightning shot out from this funnel cloud, kind of. It was hurled by the hand of someone, they thought. And what they found out is supposedly the witches had conjured up what they called the storm demon. That was their curse on the city for taking the tree from them. And the thing is, the newspapers who wrote about it, many of them write about the storm demon. That was a term
Really?
they used for this
Ah.
storm. And supposedly it was the storm demon that hurled this bolt of lightning. It hit the stump of the maple tree that had been there all those years. And the tree that sprang up that we see today sprang up in a shower of sparks and flame and smoke to replace the tree that was stolen from the witches to give them a new one. And they say it grew back the way we see it today is because they didn't want a straight, perfect tree that could be cut down again and used for a
Mhm.
maple. They gave them a knotted, gnarled, twisted tree that they'd never be tempted to chop down and use again. And so when you know that little bit to the story, it kind of, really firmly establishes this story of the witch's tree as a legend, because very often what are legends? They're usually not true,
Mhm.
but there's always some kernel of truth. There's always something that gives rise to a legend. So we have the tornado of March 27th, 1890. That's a fact. And legends, like myths, they often explain things. So this
Mhm.
gives an explanation of why the tree looks the way it does today.
Sure.
And um, it kind of perpetuates the negative stereotype about witches that we don't
Sure.
want to perpetuate about them being evil and um, levying terrible curses on people. But in the meantime, the tree has become something not associated with bad things. It's been a place where people come and they leave things for the witches to kind of make amends, to symbolize their intent not to steal the tree from them again, to kind of curry favor with them. And like I said, I know a couple people who go to the tree regularly, and they do ceremonies and generate positive energy, and they're very proud of that. But it's kind of a situation where if you build it, they will come. And so 30, 40 years ago, we didn't really know what it was, but something was going on there. You define it, you put a name on it, you
Hmm.
let people know, and it becomes a symbol. And I think that's what's happened in recent years, that even if, you know, witches, we're just going to call them witches as a group term, um, even if their history doesn't go back to those early days when there was supposedly a curse associated with the tree, in the meantime, they've come to see it as
Hmm.
something that serves them, and it's a symbol for them nowadays. And I think that's really what's interesting about a lot of these stories, especially
Yeah.
like you said, when there's oral traditions and there's nothing documented. It's always interesting to see. There's always that fine line between fact and fiction, what's true and what's not. And so stories like this, it's nice that we don't have to draw a clean line between the two and say this is what's real, this is what's not. We know something is there, and it's that gray line. I think that's really fascinating. And
Yeah.
that's why I love seeing what's going on at the tree today. People come from all over the world, leave things there, and people pay more attention to the community of witches we do have in the neighborhood.
Hmm.
And a lot of them kind of feel like they're ambassadors of the tree today, which I think is great.
And it does have like just that wonderful energy when you go near there.
Hmm.
There's almost always someone there leaving some. In fact, after your book came out, I saw a lot of the little glitter ball, like people were leaving the little glitter ball keychains.
Yeah.
Since I know you do the tours, and I know there's a someone in that neighborhood who tries to take all the trinkets off every once in a while and like calls it evil, and it's not even on
Yeah.
his property or something like that. And it just
There's always going to be that one person.
yeah.
And it's not been so bad this year, but last year there were two it was a married couple. They lived down the block and they were neighborhood grumps. They didn't approve of people leaving things for witches on trees because, witches are bad. And they
Hmm.
thought, they thought they were doing Christendom a favor by ridding the tree of all these satanic evil things. And so we were kind of doing battle because people were coming off, and you've probably seen people leave beautiful things on the tree, like
Hmm.
handmade gifts and offerings. And there used to be beautiful, like antique horseshoes and like old skeleton keys from buildings 150 years ago. Those have all been stolen in the meantime. But every time that couple would come and proudly announce they were, destroying all the evil things, twice as many people would come to the tree and put new things back on the tree. And I think they finally just got worn down and they don't do it as much as they do. There are some other naysayers. They don't like the fact that the tree has become associated with this. Most people I know, though, it's the opposite because it's getting people to that corner and that
Hmm.
part of the neighborhood. You weren't getting people out on the streets. And so
Yeah.
I have people who live on that block who say they feel the neighborhood is much safer now that we're getting groups of people there and people are stopping by all hours of the day. And I know people who live in the building, that big apartment building.
Hmm.
Two of them actually operate the Witches Tree Facebook page, and
Okay.
they moved to that building to be close, to the tree. So so far, what I see, the tree is doing a lot more good being associated with witches than it was before it wasn't associated with
Yeah.
witches. Hmm.
Well, and it's right by the park. Central Park is a beautiful place. A lot of
Hmm.
people don't know that Louisville's park system was designed by Olmsted, who also did New York's. And so there's
Hmm.
some really beautiful spaces out there. And for a long time, it was kind of dead, except for like the Shakespeare in the Park time in the summer,
Yeah.
So it's nice to have more people just over there.
Yeah, no, like I said, a lot of people are just going there because of the tree. So it's
Hmm.
been great because of that.
Yeah, I brought people over there who visited from out of town. Like, hey, do you want to see something cool? And take them
Hmm.
over. And Stephen and David own Old Louisville Brewery are right there, so it's like a nice spot to go to the park and go over
Hmm.
there. And there's just a lot of nice historical stuff. And of course, St. James Court is right around the corner, and you can see
Yep.
some of the most beautiful houses in town. And
Yep.
it's a nice area. And I think even if it doesn't actually have that witch history, like you said, it does now, and it's
Hmm.
largely positive.
Hmm.
People, I've seen people leave flowers, I've seen little kids leave like little toys and
Hmm.
stuff,
They leave
and
everything. Yeah, sometimes I see
yeah.
some stuff. I was like, I wonder what that means. But a lot of it, it just, um, like Christians and Buddhists, um, they stop by. Just
Mhm.
people of different religions stop by. So it's a very ecumenical experience,
Yeah.
is what I've been seeing.
Yeah. It's kind of like a wishing fountain, people
Hmm.
throwing their coins in. It's basically they're leaving something other than a coin. Sometimes they do leave
Exactly.
coins.
Yeah, exactly. No, a lot of people toss coins at the base, just like a wishing well. Yeah, it's a good analogy.
Yeah. And stealing that, you're just stealing someone's wishes. Like it doesn't affect
Yeah.
you at all.
Yeah, but like I said, there's
It's
always going to be
innocent.
that one person.
Mhm. Well, going back to the paranormal aspect, because that's another thing that our listeners are really into. Do you have favorite ghost stories of town? Like one that just really you enjoy the most? I don't know.
Well, I don't have kids, but I suspect it's like when someone who has kids is asked who their favorite kid is. So I'm not going to say just one, but I've got a
Sure.
handful of some of my
Okay.
favorite stories. And the house where I lived in, it had a ghost. I was told whose name was Lucy, and she was a poltergeist. And
Okay.
right before we moved in, that's when the previous owner said, "Oh yeah, Lucy, she doesn't like it if you hang pictures on this wall here, so don't hang a picture on the wall here when you move in." Of course, what's the first thing I did when I moved in? Hung a picture on
Mhm.
that wall, and they said she'd walk up and down the hallway on the second floor in the middle of the night. Within a couple of weeks of moving in, we heard footsteps, and so what we discovered after that first year, we were in the house 8 years. After that first year, we discovered all the weird things were kind of centered on the part of the house where the maid used to live. And, I was a skeptic the whole time. My friends are telling me, you have a ghost, and they were telling me I was in ghost denial. And I was always trying to come up with explanations. But at the end, we had this group of friends, and one of them was telling me, you have to talk to the ghost. You have to okay things
Mhm.
with her, and she'll be fine. And that's when we found out that everything was happening around the room that was the maid's room, we discovered. And my friend that night went through the house with a candle and kind of said a little prayer in every room and said, "Lucy, David knows it's your house. He's not gonna do anything bad. He just wants to keep it up." And I kind of scoffed and rolled my eyes, but um, from that point forward, nothing ever happened in the house. That stopped the paranormal events we have. In the book, I wrote a memoir about it called Voodoo Days at La Casa Fabulosa. And it's about how I discovered all the stuff in the neighborhood, like the witch's tree and some of the other stories. So that's book 12. It's kind of a prequel to the Darkroom in Glitterball City,
Mhm.
kind of sets me up for how we got into a situation where we almost bought a house where a dead body was discovered in the basement several years later. But my first story that I ever wrote when I was living in that house on Third Street involves a big church at the corner of Third Street and Ormsby. It's called the First Church of Christ Scientists. It's a beautiful neoclassical structure built, well, it was started in 1917. It's got these huge monolithic columns, 13 huge columns across the front. And there's a ghost there that they call the Lady of the Stairs. And that's probably, if not my very favorite, in my top three favorite stories in the neighborhood. If nothing else, just sentimental. It's the very first story I ever wrote. I have all these associations with living in, the Widmer house, my supposedly haunted house. But there's a story that people strolling down Third Street for years have reported sightings of this beautiful statuesque young lady who paces back and forth. And
Mhm.
they often see her in the evening. Very often, when it's cold outside, you get a lot of reportings of her sighting then. But she's maybe 18 or 19 years of age. She's lovely, has kind of jet black hair done up in a Gibson girl kind of hairdo.
Mhm.
And supposedly, her haunting is tied in to that building and the building's history. Um, they call her the Lady of the Stairs, but they think it's someone who actually lived in the neighborhood back in the day, and they called her Miss G. And the G stood for Gathright. They were one of the prominent local families.
Mhm.
And so today, people don't really know that. They just call her Miss G. But the thing is, she's lovely. Um, but she's a sad, forlorn kind of ghost. As she
Mhm.
paces back and forth in front of those columns, they say you often hear her sobs echo down the sidewalks.
Mhm.
And um, like I said, they see her all the time. And even though she's a sad, forlorn, lovely ghost, she's kind of a stereotypical ghost because she always wears what? Well, what do you wear if you're a female ghost? It's got to be something long and white,
Mhm.
diaphanous,
Mhm.
right? So they always see her in this kind of white robe, trailing as she forlornly paces back and forth. Well, we started hearing about those sightings, and that's what led me to start talking to people. And have you heard anything about this ghost? And people had heard this and that, and so it's a perfect example of how I cobbled things together to recreate what I think is the story. But you know, what I've discovered is, like especially now, I think it's been 20 years since my first book came out. Time passes, people get in touch and say, "No, that was my grandmother you wrote about. This is her death certificate," or "No, you had this little detail wrong." So nothing really has emerged yet to contradict what I found out about this, but they think what happened was there was this woman who lived in the neighborhood. Her name was Miss G, stood for Gathright. They were one of the prominent local families, and she was from Bardstown, the bourbon capital.
Mhm.
And in 1918, she had just graduated from high school, and she was thinking about going on and studying at university, which was uncommon for a woman back then. But her plans were thwarted because her family was having financial difficulties. In fact, they were on the verge of bankruptcy.
Mhm.
And their only hope of economic solvency was to marry their one lovely daughter, Miss G, off into one of the local distilling families. But there was only one man available for marriage at the time, and it was an elderly widower, many, many years older than Miss G. And of course, he thought that was a pretty good idea. And Mishti's parents were okay with it. Mishti wasn't excited about marrying this much
Mhm.
older man. And it wasn't just because she was so much younger, it was because she was in love with somebody else already. So it was 1918, and World War I was still, raging. And Miss G had fallen in love with the dashing young soldier. He had earned some leave. He came back to Bardstown, and they were hoping to get married on the sly, but he received a telegram telling him he had to go back and join his regiment in Belgium.
Mhm.
And so he promised Miss G, his beloved, that when the war ended, he'd come back and get her, and then they'd be married. Well, um, uh, when the parents found out, of course, they weren't happy. That was going to thwart their plans. So they endeavored to keep the two lovebirds apart. They sent Miss G away to Louisville to live with an aunt and uncle who agreed to chaperone her, kind of take her in. And
Mhm.
she lived just down the block from the church today. What they didn't know, though, is Miss G and her boyfriend had kept in touch all this time. And when the war finally ended in November of 1918 and the young soldier was discharged, he found out, because he promised he'd come back and get her and marry her when he got discharged. Well, when he was finally discharged, he found out if he reenlisted right away, he could have a very lucrative career as an officer in the military. And they offered him his choice of postings at any base across the country. And that included Camp Zachary Taylor, which locals know is a base that we used to have in Louisville, just a couple miles as the crow flies from where the church is today. And so it actually proved pretty easy for the lovebirds to still meet. They had kept in touch this time, and the aunt and uncle turned out not to be the strict chaperones the parents were hoping for. They were
Mhm.
letting their niece go out unescorted sometimes. often after dinner every night around 8:30 or so, she'd leave her front door and she'd say, "I'll see you later, Aunt and Uncle. I'm going to see my girlfriends down at Amorti's," which is a famous ice cream parlor right across from the church. It's no longer there. But it was a place, and it was the place where all the young people used to
Mhm.
hang out. And to her credit, Miss G wasn't lying. She was going and seeing her friends, but then she'd excuse herself and she'd rush back to the steps of the church across the street. And that was because back in the day, that was kind of the rendezvous spot where all the young sweethearts would meet. And any given night, there'd be dozens of couples up there rendezvousing. And that's where Miss G and her boyfriend would meet every night like clockwork. And so a month went on like this, another month. Eventually, the lovebirds grew tired of sneaking around and they decided it was just time for them to run away and elope. And so they met on a Thursday night at their normal time. And they decided the next night they were going to carry out the plan that they had been hatching. And that meant meeting at their normal time, but then going and getting the overnight train at Union Station that went to Chicago. And the young soldier had family there. So they were going to run off to Chicago, get married, and then let people deal with it when they discovered that they were married.
Mhm.
So the next night they showed up. Miss G showed up at her normal time at the ice cream parlor, and people knew something was up when she walked in because she had a suitcase at her side. And they quickly put two and two together. Everyone knew what was up, but no one tried to say anything. No one tried to stop her.
Mhm.
After a bit of small talk, she excused herself. She went over to the church, went up to the steps, started pacing back and forth, waiting for her would-be fiance to show up. But he didn't show, and she paced back and forth, and still he hadn't shown. Eventually, the evening wore on. It grew colder and darker, and all the other couples began drifting away. And in the wee hours of the morning, it was just me, Miss G, up there pacing back and forth in the cold night air. Well, right before daybreak, some late night partygoers were coming down the sidewalk in front of the church, and one of them looked up. It was a friend of Miss G's, and he said, "Hey, Miss G, why are you out so late? What's going on?" And she told him she was waiting for someone. Her friend offered to wait with her, but she said, "No, go on with your friends. I'll be fine." And so the friend continued down Third Street, but then down on the next block, he told his friends to go on without him because he didn't want to leave his friend, waiting
Mhm.
in the cold. So he rushed back so he could wait with her. He got to the steps right as the sun was coming up, and he looked up, and there was no sign of Miss Jean. He went up to the columns. He couldn't find her there. The alcoves behind the doors were open. She wasn't back in one of the alcoves, and so he assumed in those several minutes the boyfriend had probably shown up
Mhm.
after all, and they were going to get the morning train that went to Chicago. And he didn't think anything of it until the next night when darkness came. Walking by, people in the neighborhood looked up, and there Miss G was at her normal spot at the columns, pacing back and forth. This time, though, they said she looked different. She looked sickly and she was pale. And when people tried to talk to her, it was as if she was in a trance. She couldn't see or hear anybody. She just paced slowly back and forth. And the same thing happened like the night before. The other couples drifted away. It was just her eventually. But when the sun came up the next morning, she was gone until the next night. The third night, darkness fell, and there Miss G was again, sad, forlorn. This time, though, people said you could hear her sobs echo down the sidewalks as she slowly paced back and forth. And so they started to ask around, what's going on with Miss G? She's crying up on the steps. And they found out the next morning when the Monday paper came out and they were able to read about what happened at Camp Zachary Taylor over the weekend. But this, would be early 1919 now. And it's when the second of the three deadly waves of the Spanish flu hit. And estimates vary, but during that outbreak, as many as 800 soldiers died at Camp Zachary Taylor. So the night they were supposed to elope, the young soldier, he had planned on leaving. He had packed his bags, but he contracted the flu earlier in the day, and he was quarantined on the base with hundreds of others in the barracks. When the time came, he had packed his bag. He got up, tried to leave, but they caught him. They returned him to his bunk, but all night long he kept getting up, trying to sneak out through a side window with his bag. They eventually got tired of returning him. They just tethered him down to his cot, and he tried to explain, someone had to go to his girlfriend. It was cold, and she was out there all alone. But by that point, the soldier was delirious. He was incoherent, and nobody understood what he was talking about. until it was too late. And so the sad thing is that very first night they were supposed to meet, the word never made it back. And Miss G waited all night, pacing back and forth in the chill night air. She did give up and go home that next morning, but she returned to her aunt and uncle's thinking that she had been abandoned, you know. And so she was kind of heartbroken. But the really sad thing is she returned to her aunt and uncle's and she contracted the flu that very same day. And the saddest part of all, of course, is the fact that 2 days later, both Miss G and her boyfriend were dead, and they went to their graves, never ever finding out what happened to the other. So her spirit, they say, is still there today, pacing back and forth, waiting for him to show up and take her away. And until he does, we have her. The Lady of the Stairs are definitely our most romantic, if not most tragic story in the neighborhood.
Gosh, it reminds me of so many other stories, but like it also has that unique aspect of the military part, having the base here. And for our listeners, it's a very small neighborhood in terms of everything is kind of close together. It's very walkable,
Hmm.
so it makes sense you could walk from your house to this ice cream parlor. And I do find it interesting the church is kind of the rendezvous point for all of the lovers. That's kind of a
Yeah, and what I understand is it took a while to actually complete it. It wasn't like completed till the mid or late
okay.
1920s. So for the first years, it was just kind of a building site, but they had these
Interesting.
steps
Okay.
and a platform, and that kind of invited people to gather there. So
And
that's
hang out.
that's I
Yeah.
think what happened.
Kind of like a stoop in a big
Hmm.
city. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's interesting. It also reminds me a little bit of the lady in white over at the Sealbach, that story where, she's waiting for someone to return.
Well,
And
or the lady in blue, the
oh,
one
the
who
lady in blue,
fell,
that's right.
yeah, the
Yeah.
one who fell down the elevator shaft.
Hmm.
And they don't know if she was reconciling with her estranged husband or, well, there was some kind of meeting planned with
Hmm.
them. They don't know if it was an accident or maybe he pushed her or something. But yeah, it's that unrequited part. Something
Yeah.
wasn't completed, something wasn't carried through, and that's the mystery, whatever it is, that's what caused the haunting or the story today.
And you hear that a lot with a lot of the female ghosts, as kind of meetings or a lost child or something in that sort of vein. I haven't really heard that one in that much detail. I've heard it on a couple of ghost tours, but not
Uh-huh.
all those different pieces. So that's very
Yeah.
interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, that's the straight from the horse's mouth
Mm,
version.
yeah.
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 What's funny, I go when I'm in the neighborhood, sometimes I overhear people um telling stories, like versions of the stories I've written that have been, they grow and they change, and um or I hear them tell people after I tell a story that I didn't get it right. I love that, especially the
Yeah.
witch's tree. Like, oh, he didn't get
Yeah.
that part right. Like, well, I kind of did.
Well, and it's hard when you're piecing together all these human
Hmm.
versions of the story and you're not going off of like historical facts, and a lot
Hmm.
of ghost stories you'll get is, you hear a lot about little kid ones, but they won't have any evidence a child died there. And you're just kind of going off vibes and the other stories people have had,
Yeah.
and you hear that a lot at Waverly too, over at Waverly Hills. There's a few ghosts that they're able to say, okay, we have record of a person named this, but then you have some who are like, we have no idea. But, places that big and historical records get lost, and, they keep them differently in different places. It's not like now with all the electronic versions of things.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it gets, some of these stories, they're interesting. And like you said, they explain different events. They,
Hmm.
fill in gaps for things. And, sometimes they're also lessons, like maybe don't go meet your boyfriend over at Steps and get sick. The time
Yeah.
when the Spanish flu is going around,
Yeah.
um, kind of like, the old slasher movies of the 70s have their lessons of don't do these things, but they come from
Oh,
urban
definitely.
legends.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely something educational there. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's like a big part of so many myths and legends is like the education of things, and like you said, kernels of truth, and you build upon it.
Hmm.
Um and I love that you brought up Bardstown, because I know that is your next project, is a really crazy situation that I don't know if our listeners know about the series of murders and insanity that has been happening in Bardstown, Kentucky for the last what, like 10 or so years. This whole story has been going on. There's been a little bit of justice lately, which I'm very happy about, and I know
Hmm.
they're still
Yeah.
working on quite a bit more. But if you'd like to tell us about your next project.
Yeah, it's going to be by the same publisher, Pegasus
Hmm.
Crime in New York City, and they want the book to be called The Curse of Bardstown. I don't want to throw Bardstown under the bus though, and
Hmm.
um, make it seem like it's a cursed place. I don't really believe in
No.
curses. I think people self-fulfill curses
Sure.
sometimes. But Bardstown is just a pretty little town, and they just had some bad things happen recently. But it really started in 2015 when a local mother of five, Crystal Rogers, went missing. And they were pretty certain early on it was her live in boyfriend, a guy named Brooks Hauk, who's part of a very well established family with long
Hmm.
history and lots of deep Catholic roots, like a lot of people in Nelson County have after the missionaries arrived in Baltimore, Maryland. The first place they sent their missionaries farther west was to Kentucky because it was a place
Yep.
rife with sin and vice. And so Bardstown was like an old Catholic bastion. So what I discovered is, as with A Dark Room in Glitterball City, I was able to make Louisville, and especially old Louisville, a character. I can do that with Bardstown because the town is a character, it has a reputation for being often wins titles as the most charming small town or most beautiful small town in America. So there's this beautiful surface veneer, as there's always going to be, but then there's always a soft underbelly. There's something
Hmm.
that lurks beneath. And in this case, we have this disappearance that no one really was brought to justice for until last year. Her
Hmm.
boyfriend was finally convicted, and someone who works for him as well. But the whole family, they say, is involved, and there's a lot of things pointing to that. It's not just gossip. His brother, Nick Hauk, who was a Bardstown policeman, just recently was brought to trial for perjury charges because he lied on a number of things and
Hmm.
looks like he helped his brother cover it up. But the thing is, Crystal's body has never been found. So there's that there's that sense of still no resolution. Someone's been brought to justice, but the family's still suffering. And then it brings in the fact that there's some other bizarre cases. 2 years before Crystal was
Yeah.
killed, a Bardstown police officer was ambushed on the Bluegrass Parkway one night. And then Crystal's father, the year after she went missing, he was shot in an ambush one morning. He was out hunting on the family property in November. And then, in between Crystal's disappearance and the murder of Officer Jason Ellis, a mother and daughter in Bardstown, the Netherlands, were savagely attacked and terribly uh, murdered in their house. And some people think all five of these terrible crimes, it's five people, four different cases, many people think they're all involved somehow. The fact that Nick Hauk's brother was a cop, Jason Ellis was a cop, there's a lot of connections. Some of them are not very tangible, other than proximity and the places where it happened. But just exploring the options of what these connections could be is turning out to be very interesting. So that's kind of I'm going full steam ahead on that book right now, and hopefully it'll be out next year. But yeah, that's my next project. And once again, Kentucky is going to take a prominent position on the stage when the story is told.
Yeah. It's one, it's such an interesting story. There's a podcast called Bardstown for those who want to learn some more information that is pretty in depth. There, it's very thorough. And I believe they had a documentary that came out that was associated with it.
Yeah, called The Disappearance of Crystal Rogers. There's
Hmm.
so much information on that. It's like 6 or 8 parts. I can recommend that. And then just
Long.
several months
Yeah.
ago, Dateline did
Hmm.
a big feature, The Trouble with Bardstown or The Trouble in Bardstown.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of information out there. People can find out more, but it's a bizarre series of cases.
Yeah.
And um, when you're a true crime writer, often you take flack when you write about other people's
Sure.
tragedies and things. And I always, have that in mind when I write. I don't want to step on any toes and rub salts in open wounds. But
Sure.
in a situation like this where there's so many questions still out there, at least one thing that happens when you write a story like I'm writing, it keeps it in the public eye. And so there's still a chance of people coming forward if
Yeah.
they're reading the book. There's still, something in the hopes of justice still being served. So a lot of times when I have to battle those demons, wondering if I'm doing the right thing, writing true crime about other people's tragedies, that's something that kind of keeps me going. It's a way that maybe justice can, get more service in the
Mhm.
end.
Which I love that viewpoint because I mean there's still several unsolved crimes in this small town and we still
Hmm.
don't have Crystal's body, which and it's so unusual to get a conviction like this without an actual body, but
Hmm.
that's they had so much evidence that just pointed to a lot of really shady things and I'm glad her family at least got that piece, but there's still
Yeah.
so much to do because I know they also just passed the law about grand jury evidence because there was tampering with the grand jury involved in all of it. And
All the defendants' family, they showed up at the grand jury with hidden recorders. They all should be in jail for it.
yeah,
That's why some people are mad. There's a number of those family members that belong in jail who aren't
yeah,
in jail.
yeah. It's very shady. It's very
Mhm.
old school kind of cover up small town
Good old
southern.
boys kind of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Exactly. That's
A
that's the
lot of
thing
that.
that comes up over and over again. It's a
Yeah,
good old boys network.
100%.
Mhm.
Well, David, thank you so much for being on today and sharing these amazing stories with us.
Yeah.
I just have one last question.
Uh-huh.
What is your favorite bourbon?
Ooh, once again, it's like
I'm
asking
gonna
favorite
put you
kid.
on the spot.
Um, well, my decanters at home, I always have Evan Williams. He was
Mhm,
Louisville's first distiller. It's not
mhm.
expensive bourbon, it's good
No.
bourbon.
Yeah.
And I have Old Forester. That's the bourbon of Louisville. I just feel it's
Mhm,
my duty. But if I can splurge, I definitely love Pappy Van Winkle.
mhm.
I love the Four Roses,
I love Four Roses,
small
yeah.
batch and
Mhm,
single barrel. Um, I.W. Weller
mhm.
has some really good ones. Elijah Craig, I love. I
I love
mean, I'm not
Larkin.
I'm not a bourbon snob. I like most of them.
Well, and you answered like a real Kentuckian where it's a bunch of different things, especially it depends on what you're using it
I
for.
know
That's a
exactly.
big difference. When I'm
Yeah.
wanting to sip something, I like a good Willet. I'm a big Willet fan.
Hmm.
My partner, he is friends with a distiller. It's RD1, and he's like, "Oh, you're gonna love this," and he brought it to my birthday party, and there
Oh,
was none
really?
left. Everybody drank it all. So,
No,
but I
I
love
know how
Evan
that is.
Williams when I'm, making like mint juleps and things. There's certain ones you like for certain things.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. That's how I
Yeah.
am.
Yeah. Well, thank you again, David. And
All
thank you
right.
so much for all the information. And if anyone wants to read more, here is a dark room in Glitterball City. And I'll be posting more of his works, especially as the upcoming one starts coming out. So keep an eye on that space whenever you get that finished. No pressure. But I
Okay.
know it's a lot of
I'm,
work.
I'm I'm going full speed ahead. So stay
Well,
tuned.
all right. Thank you so
All right.
much.
Well, thanks for having me on. Great talking to
Appreciate
everyone.
it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.